Welcome back to another episode, all. Throughout this episode, we are going to discuss tensions which have been built between the autism researchers and the autistic community. And I'm going to be sharing thoughts and so on of what needs to be done. Let's get started. Here's the news article which was shared.
Accusations of a field in crisis or at a crossroads. Tensions have been rising between autism researchers and the community their work to.
Tensions have been rising among the autistic community and autism researchers. Well, first of all, I would say the tension has always been here, as this isn't just autism research. I would actually say this goes to a broader spectrum and goes to disability research about disabilities in general, because all of this actually begins back from the racist, sexist, ableist, eugenics movement. So all the research that autism researchers have been doing actually stems from and is rooted in ableism, sexism, and racism. Let's continue.
To benefit, particularly on social media.
On social media, it feels like road rage. It's as if you see the harm that you do to somebody. And that's when a scientist is careless about how they talk about autism. And it's also true when an autistic self-advocate is really angry with somebody maybe early in their career who's trying to get it right, but has got it wrong. If I was an early career researcher who was interested in lots of things, and I put out my first paper on autism and it was slammed by the community, I probably might step in another direction.
I would say that tension.
Just to pause there to check this woman's claims, is that language actually is very powerful. It's not this harmless thing that people say. Autism researchers are full of dehumanizing language, which is encouraged and embedded throughout all of their scripts, through all of their advertisements. It's all there. It is intentional fear-mongering, which they do all the autism charities, and it's the autism charities and so on which fund autism research. It's not the government that does so. And since these autism charities or actually hate groups like Autism Speaks, they don't want to help autistic people. So when they go saying such dehumanizing things like autistic people are inferior, no, autistic people can't think for themselves, they can't do this, they can't do that, and across other disabilities as well, not just autism. So this does go to a broader spectrum. So if they are not careful with their language, such as saying we are disordered and so on, and when there's no such thing as an ordered brain, normal brain as they like to call it, well, it's just so dehumanizing. And why wouldn't we get upset? Especially when they've known this for a long time. So since they've actually known that this language is offensive towards us and actually encourages harmful movements in the research, it shows that they are not learning from their mistakes. If it was just a mistake, it would be easy to forgive them. But the fact that they do it persistently again and again and again and are not learning from the mistakes, that seems more like they are being careless and that they don't care about what the autistic community would think and feel about it. So I do see a good reason for autistic advocates to get angry at them, because this is plain ignorance. Let's continue. Dr. Damien Milton here, I actually found him a very good man. He's the one who came up with the double empathy problem. He did, and that's brought some promising results as well concerning social matters. And I've listened to many interviews by him, and he goes pointing out that he doesn't want a cure, So one thing we can say is that there are some researchers in autism research that are not interested in curing autism, but there's clearly just as many who are interested in curing it. So the bars are still up. Let's listen.
Action's always been there. It's just being recognised now.
Dr. Damien Milton is one of the few openly autistic researchers in the field of autism research. He says it wasn't an easy area to join.
You're reading papers about yourself, describing yourself as disordered, deficient, abnormal, inappropriate. The list is endless.
Research traditionally looked at autism from a medical perspective, with non-autistic.
From the medical perspective, the medical perspective roots once again from the racist, sexist, ableist, eugenics movement. Once again, so we're seeing that disability research is rooting all the way from such a devastating movement that was made. So these researchers are going to have to acknowledge that it is their foundation from less than 2 centuries ago that they were eugenicists and that the Nazi Holocaust did take part, and that with biotechnology advancing, we actually are at a risk of another Holocaust, of eliminating autistic people again.
Researchers exploring why people are autistic or the underlying psychology. That, though, is not necessarily the research the autistic community is interested in.
Take notice of that part. It is not the kind of research that autistic people are interested in. I've mentioned on previous videos about the Autism Industrial Complex by Professor Alicia Broderick. Just going to quote a bit of Alicia Broderick's work. She points out, asking people, why did Eisenhower warn the nation against the rising military-industrial complex? I quote, first, he feared the dangerous potential for abuse of power in association with ideological monopoly and commercial profiteering. Now, just to check that part, so knowledge is power, and misusing that knowledge to do things like cure autistic people, eradicate disability, and so on, that is abuse of power. The fact that normality is ideological, it's an ideological monopoly. The fact that done fear-mongering, profiteering, commercials, we've got the same part of the military-industrial complex rising. Second, he feared that decisions about military spending would not be driven by the interest of the national security, but by the interest of the high potential for private and corporate profit. Now, as just confessed on this news, we could reword this as, he feared that the decisions about autism research would not be driven by the interests of the autistic community, but by the interest of the high potential for private and corporate profit. And that is exactly what goes on. Every April, there is something called an Autism Investor Summit, where autism charities, autism researchers of all kinds, autism interventions, pharmaceutical approaches, private equities, other stakeholders, all gather together for a private meeting. And rather than discussing what's ethical, what we should do, what's acceptable and what's not, what the autistic community is interested in, they discuss what are the best business decisions to make the biggest profit. You can even look it up online yourself, Autism Investor Summit, and you'll see it right there. And lastly, third, I quote, he also feared that any human cost of military proliferation would be regarded as insignificant in the face of the industry's enormous profitability. End of quote. Yes, in there, the the needs of autistic people, which we're going to see a bit later, are certainly regarded as insignificant compared to the enormous profitability of this autism industry and all the other autism industries that are capitalizing on autism. And that's why it's called the Autism Industrial Complex, Alicia named after the military industrial complex. Right, let's continue.
They would be asking about things around mental health or communication and social adjustments in housing, employment, things like this. But these things are woefully underfunded.
Just over 10 years ago, more than half the funding for autism research in the UK went to basic biology studies. Just 5% went on how services could support.
Just 5% went on services to support autistic people. The causes are about 15%, and that's one of the industries. Researching the causes of autism makes profitability. The treatments, in this case, we're talking about things like ABA, applied behavior analysis, which so many autistic people are greatly against. And that's another one of the biggest industries among the autism industrial complex. If you just allow me to quote someone from the Autism Industrial Complex by Professor Alicia Broderick. This is someone called Elizabeth B. Torres, PhD professor and computational neuroscientist, Rutgers University principal investigator, New Jersey Autism Center of Excellence. I quote, "Autism is at an inflection point today. We are poised for a paradigm shift in autism research, education, and therapies. This book initiates that shift and does so superbly. In the Autism Industrial Complex, how branding, marketing, and capital investment turned autism into big business. We'll learn about the history and evolution of this multi-billion-dollar per year operation. Thanks to this history, we'll remember LOVAS, ABA, and behaviorism in general, not as a science, but as a branding, rhetoric, and marketing plot that are transiently misguided many well-intended parents and professionals, and that in so doing profited with greed by preying on our human hopes, our trust in science, and our fears." End of quote. ABA is one of the biggest industries altogether in the autism industrial complex. The pharmaceutical approaches are another that goes on treatments. Diagnosis, people get greatly charged, and as I did a video about self-diagnosis, it's because of the expense why people self-diagnose as autistic. So you can see that this lot is not driven. Autism research here, the funding is not for the benefit of autistic people. Let's continue.
Support individuals. These issues have become more visible as the autistic community has changed. Over the past 20 years or so, autism diagnoses in the UK grew by almost 100%, notably among adults. And while there's underdiagnosis, particularly among women and ethnic minority groups, this large community has been able to connect over social media, share experiences, and advocate for what they want.
Members of the public are becoming more discerning and more critical about what they take part in. It's a lot of energy to do research, to be part of research, to be a participant. And I think we see it a lot more now in those online spaces of families saying, is this a good piece of research? I don't have language in this. How are they going to treat me? I feel what we're seeing now is autism researchers are being held accountable.
Autism researchers are being held accountable. Well, yes, of course they are, because they are the ones doing it. They could always refuse. They could always say, no, this research is not right. And we could go on to alternative research. I'll be covering a bit more about this soon. And as where this woman just mentioned about the language again, the language actually does bring on and run into things like eugenics.
Types of research that they are doing, and that's not necessarily happened before.
Now, the UK's largest ever study into autism is being launched today.
One of the clearest examples in recent years was Spectrum 10K, and a flashy launch on BBC Breakfast. Researchers hoped 10,000 autistic people would supply a sample of their DNA to help understand what contributes to autism and other health-related conditions. The reaction was fast and critical. Saying they would oppose such a move, some feared a DNA database risked others later trying to create a prenatal test for autism.
My major concern, what that study is saying to the world, to society, about what they think about autistic people. And it just feels that we're still at that stage where being autistic is still very much seen as a disorder.
So this brings upon the very pathologizing view, and this is where the fear-mongering gets to be done, and it works through a capital investment rather formula that they use, that capitalists use. What they do is they come up with rhetoric first, and that's what these ableist researchers have done, the ones who are ableists, the ones who are doing it for the sake of cure, rather than doing it for the sake of helping autistic people with support. They actually are doing it in the name of eugenics. I'm just going to share another quote by someone called James L. Cherney. I quote, "Such genetic determinism is a new form of eugenic thinking grounded in what the communication studies scholar James L. Cherney calls common sense ableism, a belief system that allows people to simultaneously deny any commitment to distasteful eugenic principles while also holding them up. Common sense ableism permits, even encourages, such injurious attitudes. Utilizing genome manipulation tools and performing genetic selection is tantamount to engaging in what Rosemary calls velvet eugenics, enforced by laissez-faire commercialism rather than by the state. Velvet eugenics seems like common sense, yet it hides its violence and inequality behind claims of patient autonomy and under a veil of voluntary consent. Ultimately, market-driven velvet eugenics embodies a similar goal of purging unacceptable human variations that campaigns to eliminate the supposedly unfit and inferior have held in the past. Both enact a mandate to exclude people with disabilities from coming into the world." End of quote. We already have overwhelming evidence of this, of what I just quoted, such as abortion is not being used as a civil right by many people, since over 90% of individuals that will be born with Down syndrome are aborted. We can safely say that abortion is being used as an eugenics tool, so all the biomarkers for genomic research, looking for these biomarkers that we can screen for, is a dog whistle for eugenics. Velvet eugenics, where they can manipulate people's DNA and so on with something called CRISPR by Jennifer Doudna. And I'm really not keen on it. So since we have evidence that it's not up to the individual with Down syndrome whether they get cured or not, we know it's going to be up to the parents. Throughout all of the history, the fact it's rooted in the eugenics movement only purports further to that and perpetuates these fear-mongering ideologies. And the fact it's an ideology proves it's not a science. A science is not to be based on ideologies or narratives and so on. there's clinical websites saying that they actually intend to perform genocide on individuals with ADHD. There's those saying, "Oh, CRISPR is a great hope for defeating autism, for eliminating it from the earth." So we do know that they have the will, by the fact they're already doing it to those with Down syndrome. We have a confession from them that they do want to eliminate us. And this is precisely what the Nazi Holocaust was all about, eliminating disabled people. Disallowing them to reproduce, disallowing them to pass their genes on. Only the difference between the Nazis and general eugenicists is the Nazis did it in murderous ways. They didn't just sterilize. And the sterilizations didn't stop until the 1980s. All this eugenics is not very historical. It is still very recent. Black people, for example, seen as pathological. Because as I said, this is more to do with disability in general, and with it being a racist and sexist movement as well as an ableist. That's what brings people like homosexuals as pathological, what brings black people to be said to have been subhuman and still have apes. All of this insulting research because they've got the ideology of a normal human being superior, and anyone who deviates from this normal human, there's something wrong with them and they want to eliminate them. It is entirely based upon statistics, quantitative data, not qualitative. Now let's continue.
Within 3 weeks, Spectrum 10K was voluntarily paused. 6 bodies have since said their approval still stands. In Cambridge, the team had consulted with around a dozen people, but
we didn't really expect thousands of people signing a petition to stop the study.
Just where I said we really were not expecting thousands of people to sign a petition. Well, those thousands of people were all autistic. So doesn't this show that even as recently as 3 years ago, they were still not listening to the autistic community? I would say that brings a burden upon them. And concerning the finances and so on, I would just like to try to challenge their justification, as they try to justify their eugenics by claiming autism, Down syndrome, ADHD, and so on are financial burdens. That we have financial burdens on society. Now, I'll do it with Down syndrome since it's disability in general. Look at all the screening that goes on. Less than 1% of fetuses test positive for Down syndrome, but they test 100% of fetuses. So that means over 99% of the money spent on screening was spent for nothing. It was entirely wasted. And wouldn't that 99.9% of all that money used for screening to abort and perform genocide on those with Down syndrome, wouldn't that actually exceed how expensive it is to support individuals with Down syndrome? So actually, it is more expensive to eradicate disabilities. So the desire to eliminate them is an even bigger financial burden. So I would say that makes them lose their justification, since their desires have a bigger financial burden. Let's continue.
you've been working in this area for 40 years. Does the fact that you went into this announcing the study with some naivety tell us something about there being a disconnect in some ways between autism research and the autistic community?
I think that what we've learned is that when you do consultation with the autism community, for a big study, the consultation itself has to be proportionate. So we needed to listen to a much wider range of voices, not just people close by.
Spectrum 10K have recently opened a public survey into the project's future. But despite having a major study paused, Simon denies there's any risk of a chilling effect on science.
Where Simon denies there's a chilling effect on science, well, I would have to say I agree with him, because they are not even doing science. Claiming autism is good, bad, and so on. The same with other disabilities. By devaluing them, it is an ideology. It is a social narrative. That's how left-handedness and homosexuality got into the DSM. They were ideologies. So this is not even legitimate science that these people are doing. It's not legitimate. It is pseudo. Because it is all based on the ideology of normal. So, based on average. So the average of 1, 2, 3, and 4 is 2.5. Not one of the 4 subjects, 1, 2, 3, or 4, fits the average. And their claim, one of their laws is deviation from the average equates to a disorder. Statistical deviation is a disorder. Let me show you how nonsense that is. That's no different to saying that love, hate, generosity, greed, compassion, cruelty, and all the other extremes, high IQ, low IQ, and so on, is like claiming all the extremes are pathologically suspect, because they are all deviations from the average. And second of all, this law in and of itself is flawed. Because no one fits the average to begin with, if no one's on the average, that means no one's deviated from the average. So since no one's deviated from the average, that would mean either no one's disabled or everyone's disabled, because no one is on the average. The human condition is made up out of numerous continuums, and no one is on the average on every single continuum, meaning there is no average person. According to Adolf Quatlet's own admission, the average man, which is his ideology, which Francis Galton took on board, is the impossible man. So Adolf Quatlet himself, a statistician, knew about the average man. There's no such thing. So this is not even legitimate science that we're doing on disabilities.
I don't see any negative impact, because by listening to autistic people, that doesn't mean that research should be stopped. It just means that all of these different viewpoints should be kind of part of how the design of the research goes forward. And I think we're probably at a point in the history of autism research where there's a new culture on how to do research in this area.
Simon researches both the underlying biology of and the social support for autism. He says in the long term, that will all involve actively including more autistic researchers or co-designing studies with the community. In fact, everyone we spoke to welcomed this as an opportunity for research.
I would just like to compliment on that part, because I would say from what I've seen that they are indeed some autism researchers. Most of them tend to be neurodiversity advocates, rather than the people who are after the normal brain that doesn't even exist, is such as all the neurodiversity books around me, which I've read, are by active scientists. So we know that they are scientists in the science community doing legitimate science, not based on points of view, of what's good and what's bad, but actually seeing it as natural. Autism, the genetic variation is natural. It's from nature. So it's natural variation, but then anything you say about the natural variation, is it good, is it bad, desirable, undesirable, social, antisocial, and so on, they are viewpoints, but viewpoints are not welcome in science. So fortunately, some of them actually are beginning to leave this pseudoscience of the normal brain and are coming to actual science. If you just allow me to read the blurb of PhD Thomas Armstrong's book. PhD Thomas Armstrong also has his own YouTube channel. I recommend you check his channel out. You can go into my profile and look at featured channels, and you can find his channel there. And there's some very interesting videos, especially ones to do with education, which could be a great help to children. So I'm just going to read the blurb. I quote, neurodiversity, a new term that changes the way we think about neurological disorders. Neurodiversity, the right word at the right time to account for recent evidence from brain science, evolutionary psychology, and other fields suggesting that we pay close attention to the bright spots of promise and possibility appearing in people who are differently wired. Celebrated educator and psychologist Thomas Armstrong offers a revolutionary, inspiring guide illuminating critical information such as what recent research says about specific strengths found in people with dyslexia, ADHD, autism, and other mental health diagnoses. How to construct the ideal environment niche for a neurodiverse person. How to take advantage of assistive technologies and what's to come in the future. Which career paths emphasize the gifts of neurodiverse adults? Why inclusive classrooms offer the best learning experience for neurodiverse children? A passionate, compassionate, and practical look at the myriad strengths of anyone who is differently abled. The power of neurodiversity is essential reading for parents, educators, mental health professionals, and anyone intrigued by how our brains work and what secrets they hold. A major work, revolutionary and humane, drawing on the latest scientific evidence, Dr. Armstrong argues convincingly that the disease-based model needs to be replaced by an understanding of brain differences that characterize neuropsychological conditions. This book could not be more timely. By Michelle Barber. And Temple Grandin writes something on the back as well. Temple Grandin says, I quote, parents, teachers, and policymakers should all read this thought-provoking book. I loved it. End of quote. Right, so I actually would recommend reading PhD Thomas Armstrong's book. And as one of the individuals we saw on this news article is we saw Dr. Damien Milton and so on. And I've got a book by Damien Milton right here on neurodiversity called The Neurodiversity Reader. And it's humane, it's supportive of autistic people, and it's not dehumanizing, and it's actually not going claiming that we should eradicate. And on interviews of Dr. Damien Milton, I've listened to like a YouTube video called Cure versus Acceptance about autism in some European conference. And he said that even though his son is autistic, global developmental delay, learning disabilities, and a few other conditions, he would not cure his son. He does not want to change a single thing about his son. So, and that's what I see as a loving parent. So we know that there are scientists in the science community, and that will include autism research, that actually are beginning to shift away from ABA, from all the dehumanization. But those of you who are autism researchers, you are going to have to be careful with your language.
In complete sympathy with autistic community who say, well, so much money goes on genetic research, but tell us what good that's going to do. How is it going to improve anyone's life? And we have moved our direction of research much more towards mental health and well-being, much more towards under recognition in autism in women and girls, much more towards aging, and what aging will hold for older autistic people. So I think it is having an impact.
The challenge now is to build trust and common goals. Both sides will need to play a role.
About building trust and having common goals, this is going to be the most problematic part out of all of it, because the neurodiversity movement is a political disability rights movement, meaning there's two sides. It is a debate that we're doing, so this is still not legitimate science. The autism researchers may, as individuals, be doing legitimate science. By politics interfering with this science, they're going to continue voting that no, it's an epidemic disease, it's a disorder, it's not just natural variation in neurological development, it's not natural variation among genes. The general public, it's going to be up to them, because as the way things go, it's always what the majority wants goes. And from what's going on at the minute, like the advancements in biotechnology, CRISPR, from what we've seen people do, that we're already aborting those with Down syndrome, there's clinical websites giving confessions, there's parents all over the internet advertising prevention, there's other organizations, industries advertising diets, claiming, oh, this cures your son, cures your daughter of autism. So we know that the majority still want to eradicate autism. So we know that it can't be trusted yet. Until researchers stop giving such a pathologizing viewpoint, which roots from the racist, sexist, ableist eugenics movement. So autism researchers, you are going to have to acknowledge that that is your foundation, the very foundation of what you're based upon, is you're based on illegitimate science, believing humans are genetically deterministic, disregarding the epigenetics, disregarding what autistic people themselves think, and going by quantitative data rather than qualitative, as you claim your goal is to increase the quality of life, but quality of life is a subjective viewpoint, which is qualitative research, not quantitative based on statistics. So not only are you going to have to change your goals, but you're also going to have to change how you conduct research. You're going to have to be more open about your goals rather than just asking for things like DNA. We see that autistic people aren't allowed to donate embryos, for people who can't have children in the natural way. So we still know that the vast majority want to eradicate disabilities, not accept them. So the eugenics movement actually is still ongoing. As I said, the sterilizations didn't stop until the 1980s. The Nazi Holocaust was as recently as the mid-20th century. But it's not very historical. The eugenics movement is the cause of World War I and II. It caused both world wars. It's the cause of biological racism, biological sexism, and just so much abuse. Then we've got ABA using aversive techniques on autistic kids, and still this day in the Judge Rotenberg Center in North America, they still do electronic shocks on individuals with developmental disabilities. So the fact that the Food and Drug Administration is not willing to stop it, even though they have the authority to do so, the fact that the BACB, who sends the BCBS to the Judge Rottenberg Centre, are not willing to take them out of the Judge Rottenberg Centre, the fact that none of the professionals are actually criticising this shock therapy just provides more evidence that you're thinking we've got to be so-called normal, and so on. So it is still dehumanising the field of autism research, or as I said at the beginning, disability research, not just autism. So until the society changes its perspective about disability, this problem is going to remain, the tension is going to stay. We are going to have to keep blowing the whistle, sounding the alarm, until this pathologizing viewpoint stops. And just to note on disability, disability always has been and always will be contextual. It's always to do with the social settings. For example, if we think about the education system and learning disabilities, whether someone's seen as a person with academic or learning disabilities is due to which subjects are being taught in the education system. What we come to see is the subjects being taught are the things that the majority of people find easy, but what the majority struggles with are outside of being excluded from the education system, which meant excluding the strengths, the talents of disabled people. If we taught every subject in the education system, we would see an equilibrium between talent and difficulty, between strength and weaknesses. So it would bring an equilibrium and show equality among ability and disability. For example, in the brain science, which PhD Thomas Armstrong mentions, what we come to see is autistic brains, the brains of people diagnosed with autism, because really there's no such thing as an autistic brain, it's just the brain. That's basically all it is. And then the same with ADHD, there's no ADHD gene, there's no schizophrenic gene, and so on. So really, altogether, everything is back to front. You know, what we see in all the interventions is they're trying to modify humans to fit into a society. As I said, we've got great medical advances, more knowledge in biology, and so on. So doesn't it seem odd to you that our world health as a collective is consistently deteriorating? Well, why do we need to produce more drugs? About 70% of the United States are on antidepressants. Why? So why do we need all of this if our health is advancing? So clearly the health's not advancing. And the cause of this, which I say, is scientists are putting society first, humans second. Human needs are being disregarded, ignored, for the sake of modifying a person to fit into society, and so on. But if we made society evolve around human needs would be acknowledged. By human needs being acknowledged, they'll be fulfilled, and needs being fulfilled concerning health, we would not have so many health problems. It is all down to putting society first and humans second. And that's the big problem I see, and why our world's health is consistently deteriorating. A book which I would recommend is one called The Myth of Normal, by someone called Dr. Gaber May and the co-author, his son Daniel May. They both contributed to this book, and I strongly recommend it. It's absolutely brilliant, and it provides examples of how the DSM system, the way things currently are, is absolutely ridiculous, is illegitimate, falsehood, false conclusions, all based upon the ableist assumptions. So, if you just finish off. Yeah. If you have made it this far, thank you for listening. Please help spread the message that autism research does need to be changed. There does need to be more communication between, and we need people to stop talking about autism and other disabilities in such dehumanizing ways. We've got to stop it viewing brains as pathological just because they do not suit society. The truth is, society does not suit humans. Society does not accommodate human needs. And that's why health disorders are persistently increasing, why more people are developing schizophrenia, why the diagnosis rates of everything are just persistently increasing. Because of sensitivity, as the world's getting harder to endure, the people who are more sensitive are actually the ones who are getting diagnosed with so-called disorders. But what we see is they are actually coping mechanisms, these manifestations, whether it's autism, Down syndrome, and so on. These disorders, as they like to call them, but we prefer disability, is all down to society. It's not down to biology, because we are not isolated organisms. We have an interconnected state, but the medical model cannot acknowledge that, since it studies everything in isolation. So the interconnected state is immediately cut off, meaning the medical system is not dealing with things in the way they actually are in the real world. And that's probably why there's always going to be side effects from medical treatments. The neurodiversity movement does not oppose treatment. It opposes specific treatments. For example, I've never come across any neurodiversity advocate who claims that, say, we should not try and prevent epileptic seizures. If someone's diagnosed with epilepsy, we should give it medical attention. So what we say is the social model of disability, the medical model, need to intersect near the middle. Anything which falls into the social category, that means something about the society needs adapting. If it falls in the medical category, that means it's not society, such as with my epilepsy, for example. Regardless of where I am, regardless of what's happening, I can always have epileptic attacks. So that shows it is not the society's responsibility for I to have seizures. Society may be able to pull seizure triggers, which is why I avoid certain situations, but it's not the society's fault or the design of society that I have epileptic seizures. So I would just like to finish by pointing out that we could say that those who are not seen as disabled, since they're defined as neurotypical or normal, we could say neurotypicality is a neurobiological disorder preoccupied with social concerns, a delusional sense of superiority, and an obsession with conformity. We could say that because that is the way they behave. And that does sound like a disorder due to the lack of independent thinking, the lack of thinking outside of the box, the lack of creativity. of how they are socially dependent, not independent, of how they will sacrifice their own values just for the sake of social acceptance, while autistic people are willing to do the opposite. So everyone can be defined as disabled, it just depends on the context. As I said, disability is contextual, always has been and always will, more related to social matters, by trying to come to a mathematical understanding of the social world, rather than trying to come to a social understanding of the social world. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. If you're interested in seeing of how the eugenics movement caused so much murder, caused so much abuse and trouble, keep an eye on my channel or subscribe and you'll be able to see a series I'm going to produce, because it is a long story, the eugenics movement, since it began nearly 2 centuries ago and is still ongoing today. Thank you for listening.